Okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Fania Oz-Salzberger, that you already know. Fania is professor in history at the University of Haifa, newly appointed director of Paideia, and maybe a special book out of many is the book Jews and Words that she co-authored with her father Amos Oz, that I highly recommend. That will tell you a lot about Fania's worldview, but also actually a lot about Paideia, even though it was before Paideia. Yes. The title of Fania's talk today is The Nomad, the Merchant, and the Refugee. 3 Jewish Paths, 3 Global Metaphors. So, please, Fania.
I can sit here wagging my legs, so I can go out there. First of all, let me put this on, so everybody can hear me. Okay, can everybody hear me now? Yes. Loud and clear? Hey, shalom. Assalamu alaikum. Before I delve into my presentation, which will not be very long, let me just reassure everybody that Paideia, the good old Paideia, Barbara's Paideia, is still alive and well. And when people ask about the Volkshochschule, how did I pronounce it now?
Very well.
The answer is that Paideia has just become a mother, which is a very Jewish thing to do, you see. So the Volkshochschule will be Paidea's cultural college, a brainchild, a child of the heart, a child cooperating with the Kishta Muslim Cultural College, and adjacent to Paideia, but not exactly the same thing. So there is the old and wise Paideia, and there is the new and bright Paideia. And Noah Hermann belongs to both of them. So I chose, given the topic of bayit, I chose 3 personalities who are out of the bayit, out of the home, away from home, sometimes very far from home. The nomad, the merchant, and the refugee. It might sound counterintuitive to put the 3 of them together, but let me assure you that all 3, the nomad, the merchant, and the refugee, are represented even here in this audience. We are all either refugees or children or grandchildren of refugees. Maybe we are nomads, maybe descendants of old nomads, or maybe we are new 20th century global nomads. And we are merchants of merchandise, of goods, of ideas, most of us, perhaps all of us. So all these 3 themes, which are very ancient in Jewish history, and very symbolic in Jewish history, and also in human history, converge in this room, and converge also in the Jewish story. Now, beginning with bayit, I'm going to do a very time-honored Jewish thing, which is to dispute something that was said here on this stage before, by a person I deeply respect. Yesterday, Moshe Halbertal, giving the opening keynote of this conference, spoke beautifully about bayit, about the concept, the terms, the ideas, the philosophy, and much of what he said spoke to me very well. But I have one controversy. You can ask, so why do you take the one controversy instead of saying all that you agree with? And my answer is because this is what makes Jewish life so interesting. And my controversy with Moshe Halbertal began at the moment that he defined bayit or home as some place where you can kick off your shoes, relax, and be off guard. Off guard was the term used. And I said to myself, oh, great goodness, what a masculine thing. I was going to ask a question about this, the feminist critique, but my husband snapped the microphone from me. It's okay, again, you I will have another chance. Because, okay, let's take this serious. Now I'm being serious and I'm being a historian. The first philosopher who more or less defined the family or the homestead, the family group, was Aristotle. Athens, 5th century BC. Aristotle says that the homestead or the family unit comprises of two unequal pairs, husband and wife, master and slave. And let me tell you that until the early 20th century at least, if no longer, the home, the homestead, the family group was comprised of men and women, children, and upstairs and downstairs, servants, slaves, field workers. The only person, until quite recently, the only person who could come home, kick off his shoes, relax, and be on guard was the pater familias. I'm not talking about some families today. But until recently, neither the wife, nor the kids, nor the servants could be off guard. They were on guard, they were on duty in the home. Why is this critique so important? Because we must never idealize anything. We must never idealize the family, not even the Jewish family. We must never idealize the home, not even the IKEA home. We must never idealize the state of Israel, or the continent of Europe, or European Union, or global love and friendliness, because if we idealize too much, we forget about the dark corners that everything has. And there is a dark corner everywhere, even in a wonderful world. I would like to begin in earnest by quoting two wonderful Hebrew poems, Yehuda Amichai and Natan Zach, who both wrote very wise and beautiful lines, some of their major poems, about the home. About what happened when the door closes and we are at home. Natan Zach wrote in his poem Shir LaOhavim HaNevonim, which translates as, help me Frida, a song or a poem for the wise lovers. And the whole poem tells them, you, the wise lovers, live happily, close the door, and hug one another. Do not let anyone in. There is a line there that says, if a stranger knocks on your door, don't let him in. And even the poet is singing out there in the darkness out of bitterness, don't let him in. Remain indoors, remain hugging one another. And the song is, of course, partially satirical and critical, but partially also admires the capacity of the lovers to lock themselves in the bayit, in the home, and leave everybody out. Yehuda Amichai, in another song, I think it's Shir Leil Shabbat, if I'm not mistaken, has this wonderful line, והבית נסגר בלילה על הטוב והרע שבו. You know this one? It's a wonderful song. My poem made it into a song. And the house at home closes at night, including what's best and what's worst about it. The good and the bad shut down for the night. I think this is wonderful because both of these poems tell us that even the indoors of family bliss is never only blessing. There is always a snake, a serpent in paradise. There is always a corner of darkness, even in the best lit home. But, I say this about home and also about my beloved country of Israel, we need to recognize the darkness. We need to acknowledge, we need to resist idealizing. But we must never see the darkness alone. It is the light that we must observe and use even when we diagnose the darkness. Now, some of the speakers before me have already noted that I would like to repeat because I have some additions. That the Hebrew word bayit is much more than home or house. It has so many different meanings. And I'll give you a few that you haven't heard yet. So of course, it's home, it's house, it's property, it's a temple, Beit HaMikdash, it's a tribe, this has been mentioned, the family, but it's also a school of thought. Beit Hillel versus Beit Shammai, the two great Mishnaic schools of thought. Each of them was called a house, a home of ideas, a home of intellectual mentality in this case. It can also be a human body. It can mean a bird's nest, the nest of a bird. It can mean the stanza in a poem. Bayit in a poem or a song is a stanza, a verse of a poem. And most deeply and anciently, it simply means a hollow, a vessel. Some kind of a tool or a natural form that has a hollow inside. This is the most ancient sense of bayit in Hebrew, just like the form of the letter itself, which is something like this. Upside, I know, I should have done it there. Next way. This is why the same word bayit can be Beit HaMikdash, the temple, the first temple, the second temple, but it can also mean Beit HaShechi, an armpit, the hollow you have under your arm, under your shoulders. Same word for the most sacred, the most profane meaning. An empty vessel, it's our job to fill it. It's our job to give meaning and content to the bayit, whatever bayit it is. In the Bible, quite a few times in Ecclesiastes, bayit comes with the notion of wisdom, but sometimes also with pain, agony, and death. It appears in many dichotomies of good and evil, rich and poor, safety and destruction, happiness and gloom. In the book of Proverbs, a prostitute is a woman who resides in an anti-bayit, a home which has no joy, no family, no. Also a bayit, but like a negative picture of a. So considering this dazzling array of meanings and significance, we can safely say what bayit, it's very difficult to say what bayit is, but we can tell what bayit is not. The Jewish bayit of the Bible, the Old Testament, the later books, Talmud, the rabbinical literature, all the way to modern Hebrew. The Jewish bayit was never an Englishman's castle. It never had the defensive elements that the English applied to their own homes. It was never imperturbable, impenetrable. The Jewish bayit was always shaky. It could always fall. It was wobbly. It was replaceable. It was carried on one shoulder when one had to flee from the pogrom, holding the child under one arm and the book under the other arm. That was home suddenly. And it is never a comfort. So its essence of belonging and identity is counterpointed by loss, doubt, and dismay. Bayit can negated or stood vis-a-vis the great outdoors, the Garden of Eden, and note that the Garden of Eden was a garden, not a home. Very, very interesting. The first couple, the first human couple, lived in a garden, not in a house. Useful thought there. And also, from the very early Bible, the bayit stands vis-a-vis the nomad's tent, which can also be a home in a way. The hunter's great outdoors. Think of Jacob sitting in the tent and his brother Esau being the hunter in the great outdoors. And also there is the house and the runaway or the refugees wilderness. You see, nomads and merchants and refugees all dwell within the concept of bayit. They tread three ancient paths of Jewish existence and imagination, of human existence and imagination. These are our longest paths from Adam and Eve all the way to the post-modern world. And I will say a few things about the nomad, about the merchant, and about the But first, let me also say what I liked very much. It was a point that Moshe Halbertal briefly made, but it is a point well taken. You see, we here, even at this conference, coming here in the morning from our comfortable bed and lovely Swedish breakfast, I still have to learn to deal with lovely Swedish breakfast, we can easily discuss home, bayit, as an abstract an allegory, a metaphor. There is home, there is homelessness. It's very postmodern. And Moshe said at some point when he was sitting here, he said, yes, but my grandfather in the shtetl, when he had to flee for his life, he was not a literary critic. It's all very well to speak about homelessness when you are a tenured professor in Berkeley or in Stockholm. It's not so easy to speak about home and homelessness when you live in the real world and especially in poverty. This reminds me of Ellie's grandmother. I hope I'm allowed to tell the story. Not a story, but just an anecdote. Ellie's grandmother, whenever one of her children or her grandchildren used to come home with a friend, a lover, a suitor, she had a triple question. Of course, she didn't ask the guest. Would take her child or grandchild into the kitchen and fiercely whisper to him or her, who is he? What is he? Does he have a roof over his head? And when I came as a prospective girlfriend, I'm sure she also asked you, who is she? What is she? Does she have a roof over her head? That's a very Jewish way of questioning. And ever since the time I took it philosophically, sometimes I stop and ask myself, Fania, who are you? What are you? Do you have a roof over your head? But of course, the origin of the question was not allegorical and not metaphorical. And it came deeply from the need for survival in difficult conditions. The need to make sure that the shidduch would be okay. The need to make sure that the home can continue. And when I look at the Jewish shtetl, and not our idealized Jewish shtetl, but the real Jewish shtetl, with the crowdedness, the dire poverty, the hunger in the winter of East Europe, the diseases, the real hardcore reality. And you know, when I recently thought about the Jewish shtetl, it was when I was proudly finishing the first volume out of 5, I think, of Per Anders Fogelström's Stockholm series. The first volume which depicts in such naturalistic terms the dire poverty of the old Södermalm and its working class residents. This is very near the shtetl. This is real poverty, this is real homelessness, or real crowdedness under a roof leaking with rain. Whenever we use bayit, home, homelessness as grand metaphors for the 21st century, we have to think of this, of the old shtetl, of the old Sodoma. This was the social historian speaking. And now I will go back for a little bit to the history of ideas. Who was the first nomad? Who was the first merchant? And who was the first refugee? I will not try to delve into global history or mythology, but I will look at the Tanakh, at the Hebrew Bible, at the book of Genesis, because they are all there. You see, but first let me explain the difference between a nomad and a refugee. You might think it's the same, it's totally not the same. The merchant, we know, the merchant has a home, sometimes even a well-to-do home, but the merchant has to travel the world in order to distribute his or her merchandise, be it wood or cloth or iron or ideas. And merchants, to this day, from very early days, were global travelers, often in a good sort of way. The nomads traveled and still travel not because they do not have a home, but because the nomad is inside them, it's part of their psyche. Either they carry their home as a tent and like it, or otherwise they decide not to settle down. Ancient nomads, modern nomads, very often was a matter of lifestyle, of proud birth and belonging, of tribe, or in modern days, simply of choice. In many ways today we are all, as I called the Israelis in Berlin in a recent article, wired global nomads, the new internet nomad. The refugee has not chosen. And like the merchant, the refugee has left a home behind. But unlike the merchant, the refugee in most cases cannot return to her or to his home. Like the nomad, the refugee is traveling the great outdoors from place to place. But unlike the nomad, the refugee is neither born to this lifestyle, nor does she or he love this lifestyle. They are looking for a new home. So each of these groups is quite different in distinct ways. And I think that the first nomad ever might have been Cain. He is also the first assassin, the first murderer. And the strange thing about Cain, we are thinking about Cain after he killed his brother Abel. But in fact, recall that even before he killed his brother Abel was the shepherd, the one who already lived in tent at least, whereas Cain was the hunter hanging around the fields and the meadows and the mountains, even before the murder. And certainly after that, he was doomed to constant nomadic life. The first nomad. Strangely enough, it didn't do him any harm. Not only did God decide to protect him by putting the Ot Cain, the sign of Cain on his forehead, but also Cain ended up doing two other things that we often forget. Cain built the first city. Genesis tells us that. Strange, a nomad building a city, but there you go. And Cain was also the father of all of us. Because if Adam and Eve only had two sons and one of them was killed by the other, the murderer is our great parent. Of course, there are many midrashim, many explanations who they marry and so on. Turns out they all had sisters and married each other's sisters and so on. But having said all that, Cain, fortunately or unfortunately, is the great nomad, entrepreneur, city builder, murderer, killer, repenter, who is the great parent of man. So we need to look at Cain with respect and a tinge of regret that it was Cain and not Abel was our great ancestor. But there we have it. That's where we all come. The first merchant may have been Abraham himself. Because the first time that the word socher, or merchant, appears in the Bible, and that's quite early on, is when Abraham is doing a real estate deal with a guy called Ephron, the Canaanites. And what is Abraham buying from Ephron? Anybody? Me'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah, which would become the burial site of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and they speak, they negotiated, and then וישקול אברהם לעפרון את הכסף, אשר דיבר באוזני בני חת, 400 שקל כסף עובר לסוחר. I will translate, but note it's already a merchant culture, because what happens is that Abraham weighs the pieces of silver. They already have weights, 9, weighs it. He gives exactly the amount that they have decided beforehand, which makes 400 silver shekels. Can't buy much in Tel Aviv these days. 400. Certainly not real estate. I don't know about stone. And not only 400 well-weighed, carefully weighed silver shekels, but over lasocher, which is an expression we still use in modern Hebrew today, meaning legal currency. Over lasocher, the kind of currency that merchants would accept. And the word socher is the word merchant, over lasocher, acceptable to merchants. So that's the first time a merchant is the word, and the actual act of trading is mentioned. Who was the first refugee? Again, the book of Genesis, interestingly enough, these early chapters of Genesis give us all 3 types. Because if Cain is the first nomad, and Abraham perhaps is the first trader or merchant, also a wandering merchant, the first refugee, the word palit, which is still the modern Hebrew now word for refugee, comes from a big war that was held in Canaan, and Lot, Abraham's nephew, was taken prisoner, and one escapee from the captured town comes to tell Abraham what happened, or Abraham before it tell Abraham, and that is palit, refugee, that's the word. But beyond the word, who is the character? And for me, this ties very much with the previous session. The first refugees were a mother and son. The mother was called Hagar, and the son was called Ishmael. They are the first people we have in biblical narrative to be deliberately turned out of their home because of hatred. In this case also because of jealousy of the other wife, the single wife of Abraham, the matriarch Sarah. She's not all bad, but in this particular moment, this is not Sarah's best moment. And she makes Abraham turn out Hagar and Ishmael to the desert, and they become nomads, first refugees and then nomads, against their will. They were house dwellers. They were the wife and son of Abraham. And now they have become refugees, and Ishmael and his progeny will become also famously nomadic. This is the biblical way of expression. But it started, and this is important to say, not because they wanted to be nomads, but because they were kicked out of a home. So here you have it, all 3. Before moving to the modern world, in which I want to end my talk here about the nomads, merchants, and refugees of the modern world, let me just mention that there is one guy, a lovable guy, although not a perfect guy, also in the book of Genesis, who is all 3 in some ways, both the nomad and the merchant and the refugee. This guy is where the word bayit appears for the first time. Interestingly enough, it appears for the first time in the most initial sense I told you about, the inner hollow. And I read in Hebrew, that's chapter 6 of Genesis. עשה לך תיבת עצי גופר, כי מין תעשה את התיבה, וכפרת אותה מבית ומחוץ לגופר. בית ומחוץ. Make yourself an ark. Make it out of kinim, that is the kind of, actually Moses' ark was made of the same materials, interestingly enough. So the kind of things that grow, the bamboo shoots that grow by the river, and then you have to make sure that it's beautifully clayed, like with good clay to make it waterproof, mibayit and michutz, from inside and outside, bayit meaning outside. And then God says to Noah, who is my character here, and now walk into the ark, ata v'kol beitcha, you and your whole family. So the word bayit appears twice in this story for the first time. Bayit as in the inside of the floating ark, the vessel, and bayit as in the family of Noah that comes into the ark. Strangely enough, this Noah's ark, floating on the high waters of the ancient flood, on its way to Ararat, that little Noah's ark, with all the animals and all our ancestors in there, except the fish and the birds, that little Noah's ark was the first true bayit in the Bible, the first time the word is mentioned. And look at Noah himself. Insofar as he flees the deluge, the flood, with his family, he's a refugee. Not a refugee of human viciousness, but of nature. But of course, this natural catastrophe came because of human viciousness. So in a way, he did flee human viciousness. He's a refugee. As long as the ark is wobbling on the water of the whole Western Asia, he's a nomad. A maritime, a seafaring nomad, but definitely a nomad. And insofar as he is carrying with him everything left of the old world, the antediluvian, the pre-deluge, and bringing it to the future world, to our world, he is also a merchant. Because this is what merchants deeply do. They take something precious and preserve it for the future by passing it, by moving it. Noah is for me all the three put in one. He's not yet Jewish, but he's getting there. And just to remind you guys, he was not a perfect guy in many different ways. He had how many sins, Rabbi? I can think of two big ones, but I think he had more, right? Okay. And now fast forward to our day. Over the millennia, Jews have been nomads and merchants, traveling merchants, and alas, also refugees. Over the years, they have lived in their wobbly homes, knowing that the home is never totally safe, knowing that the home has to be refuged, or carried their whole home on their shoulders. It was not only books. I know that it's easy to romanticize. They were not carrying only books. They also had to carry diapers for the babies, and food for the hungry kids. And some kind, my great aunt survived the Nazis by fleeing to Siberia with a roll of towel cloth that she sold at every train station. And that's how they kept going. They fled with very physical, with things that would keep them alive. But yes, also books. And if you ask me what makes Jews unique in pre-modern times, because in modern times everybody joined. In pre-modern times, I would say they were the only nomad travelers, refugees, traders with books in their backsacks. There were many others, but the Jews also had books, never only books. So nowadays when we talk about the 20th and the 21st century. We would have thought, in the height of liberal optimism, perhaps in the 20th century, perhaps in the 1950s, that everybody will have a home of the American kind, you know, a kind of a suburban paradise, and there would be no more nomads, suspicious, no more merchants traveling, no more refugees. How wrong we were. Because today, in our early decades of the next millennium, 21st century, the world has once again filled with merchants traveling, the international trade. We thought it might subside because electronics will take its place, but I think it's not happening. I think we are all traveling more and more, carrying our goods, tangible and virtual, our ideas, our merchandise around the globe. This is the greatest time of the traveling salesperson. Not the Middle Ages, as we once thought, but today. And I find this a blessing. Not just that we exchange ideas, crafts, and know-how, and high-tech, and merchandise, but also that we travel towards each other and with each other. I would be even happier when we stop polluting the globe with our travels. And I think we are working on that. But I like the fact that we meet in person. Not everything is virtual reality or a Skype conference. Look at nomads. People will thought that the nomad will disappear because the nomad has always been considered poor and a little suspicious, or a radical, a gypsy, a hippie, a Jew, always looked upon suspiciously by the home dwellers, by the home. But 21st century nomads are becoming a huge and fairly respectable tribe. Many of the young people I meet, including Israelis, who are traveling the world, no longer belong to one place. They may have a home. They may be, as they call it today, between homes. They may be subletting and subletting and subletting. It's also a new term, by the way. And yet, they are nomads by choice and joyful. The world is full of this new kind of nomad. And I think it's a good thing, because each and every one of our Paideia fellows is now a global nomad, at least for a while, and maybe even enjoying it. The refugees, we thought that would be over too. We thought that the horrible aftermath of the Second World War may be the end of the long dark history of the refugee. Unfortunately, we know otherwise. And refugees, no longer Jewish refugees, but so many others, Muslims, Christians, many other denominations. The movements of refugees in the world, of course, everybody is thinking about the Middle East, but I would like also to turn your gaze to Africa and its terrible situation in some parts of Africa of inner refugee situation. East Asia. If you go to Vietnam or to Cambodia, along the great river of Mekong, you still see the wobbling, weak homes or boats of refugees who are still refugees, who are not allowed to move, ethnic Vietnamese in Cambodia and vice versa. The world is still full of refugees of the desperate kind. It's the sad. Sometimes I think, I'm getting near the end, sometimes I think that the real resolution of the refugees' agony, because it's never fun to be a refugee, the real resolution of the refugees' agony may not lie in the hands of the safe and secure home dwellers. They are too safe, they are too secure, they are too suspicious of the other. which lies in the hands of the new nomad and the new of people who know enough about the world to care and to recognize that differences are bridgeable by human compassion, who are sophisticated enough to know how to do it, and who are wired enough, as I said before, wired global nomads, to recognize new ways of resolution. So I take myself to be a traveling merchant of ideas, that's my merchandise, which means I can only take the hand luggage on the plane, I don't need to share much more. And also a nomad of sorts. And it is us who are best able, both in terms of the brain and the heart, both in terms of know-how and compassion, to lend our hands to the refugee. I could have ended here, but a quick point about Israel. I think it's important. You see, some of the speakers in this conference took home and homelessness into the tension field of Israel and diaspora. And there's something I want to say, and with this to end the official part of the I do not buy anymore into the Israel diaspora dichotomy. This is a credo I want to place here to you right now as I begin with Paideia. I do not think that here stands Israel, bayit, home, national home, and here is the diaspora, anti-bayit, homelessness, exile. Maybe it worked like this for many centuries, especially in the imagination of the diaspora, but not anymore. The generation of my children, my students, our fellows, and ourselves. For the generation of new nomads, 20th century nomads, of globalized meeters and traders. Israel is not only part of the world, even when it pretends not to be. It is also part of a Jewish world, of a global Jewish world. It is an important part of it. It is a big part of it, both demographically and culturally, but it is part of it. Enough with the dichotomy. Enough with the opposite mentality. We no longer oppose. We belong to the Jewish world. Members of the Jewish world, we find, by the way, in the broadest sense, anyone interested in things Jewish and ideas Jewish, belong to Israel. Israel's non-Jews are part of my home, and they are also welcome. Witness the Arab-Israeli writer Said Kashua in Ann Arbor. They are also very welcome as members of the Jewish. We have to reinvent our geography. We have to reinvent our mental belongingness. And for this purpose, we should all be, even those who love sitting at home and reading a book by the lamp, we should all be a little bit of global merchants and a little bit of global nomads, but hopefully never again refugees. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have some time for questions or comments, remarks.
Disagreements?
So I will start. So if not the definition that Moshe Halbertal presented, you said from a feminist point of view, you disagreed. So what is the definition you would like to propose?
Of a home, of a bayit? A bayit is a place where after running around and cleaning up after your kids and your better half and your dogs, you can finally truly put your feet up and read it. Yes, we have a question.
Can you hear me? Yes. I just want to fill in. There is a study, Swedish study, it's about 20 years old, about just what you were talking about. Men came home and they were resting, and women started to, and the stress level, increased. But that's, I can tell you about that now.
Very interesting.
Yes.
Makes sense.
Made at the big company of Volvo. Okay, my question to you is what? Could you please develop your end about Israel? I'm not sure I understood all your thoughts about that. Please.
Okay, there are several schools of thought. I'll pick up one, which is academically very fashionable. At least was very fashionable. I think slightly now less so. A kind of school of diasporic self-assertiveness led by Daniel Boyarin and several other historians. And I think some of the speakers here also reflected this to some degree. The idea that Israel is trying to undermine the rest of the Jewish world by saying, as old Zionism indeed said, everybody should come to us. There's no longer such thing as diaspora. We are the end of diaspora. Zionism is the end of diaspora. You should all pack up and come over, otherwise you are counterproductive or counter-logical. I call this old Zionism. I grew up in it in a way. Centripetal Zionism, drawing in, and magnetism drawing everybody in, to Eretz Israel, to the state. But not all Zionism was like that. There were always people, and still are, many more now, that are not centripetal, they are centrifugal. And I'm one. So what I'm saying that instead of blaming all Zionism for all the wrongs of the world, which doesn't carry all the wrongs of the world, including the diminution and insult of the Gola, of the diaspora of the Jewish world, what we need to do is to draw the other lines of the tradition. My own ancestors were so deeply European that they remained so even when they were Chalutzim, pioneers in the land. Other people I know who came from the North Africa, the Sephardi world, or the world of Iraqi or Yemen Jews, also brought with them very many valuable things, and if it be up to them, they would have gone back and forth the old Jewish way, like the Babylonian Talmudic way and the Jerusalem Talmud and their interaction. Moroccan Jews are the only ones lucky enough to be able to visit their own homeland, and they're already creating very interesting exchanges between Morocco and Israel. So the new approach, which has already been on the cards for several decades, but is now becoming even more powerful, is not to say that Israel is an insult to the diaspora because it diminishes it to nothing, but to say Israel is now a proud and prominent member of the globe, of the Jewish and beyond Jewish, more than Jewish. And I'm telling you that every time I go to those wonderful new cultural festivals, all over Europe, some of them old and some of them brand new, film festivals, book festivals, music, theater, you name it. The intermixture of Jewish and Israeli culture is a wonderful thing. They enrich one another. Also including non-Jewish Israeli culture, like many of the things. So I hope I made it clearer now. There's no need to see it as a kind of a linear, two-end tension. Instead, I'd much rather use the metaphor of the globe, the openness, and the centrifugal sense of well-being that Israel can emanate. And if I meet Israelis around the globe doing wonderful things in Silicon Valley, or in the German Bundestag, everywhere I go now, I meet gifted Israelis doing wonderful things. I rejoice. I don't want them all in Tel Aviv. You know how crowded it is? You don't really want.
Sorry, thank you. I have a question that has actually been on my mind all day. You are lucky enough to be able to answer for all of your colleagues and you. It's a question about language with regard to home. And when you talked of the image of the Jew going around with carrying books, usually the books were in Hebrew, or written in Hebrew letters, even if they were in other languages. And I am just wondering where Hebrew fits in with all of this. And you mentioned Boyar, and he's not gone, and I also know what he's been doing with Hebrew, and yeah, but my question is where the Hebrew language fits in with everything you've been addressing.
Thank you so much. I couldn't hope for a better question. You know, when we wrote our book, Jews and Words, my father and I, 3 years ago, 4 years ago now, we wrote it in English. People said, what? Amos Oz is writing a book in English? So in fact, I was the one who wrote it in English, but we co-authored it in English for a reason. Because you see, we are both patriots of Ivrit. I'm no nationalist. I don't keep anything in a kind of a proud nationalist sort of spectrum, except for one thing, which is the Hebrew language. I love it dearly. I really do. But the Jews never lived in one language alone. Not even in biblical times. They spoke other languages too. Biblical Hebrew is full of loan words from other languages. I think I mentioned it the other day, you know, when we put the mezuzah. Mezuzah is a Persian word. It's also a Persian concept. Piyut is poesis. It comes from Greek, and so on and so forth. It was never a kind of a pure glass globe with the Hebrew, holy Hebrew language. The Torah has many loanwords from other ancient Middle Eastern languages. And then, of course, by Talmudic times, most of us were not even speaking Hebrew. We were speaking Aramaic, and we were speaking Babylonian. And continuing this, the languages of the Jews include Greek and Roman and Arabic, very much Arabic. And Maimonides, some of his most important works, are also in Arabic. And we have Spanish languages, and we have, of course, the Hispano-Judaic, which branches off towards Ladino, and we have the so-called Germano-Judaic, which branches off towards Yiddish, and every modern European language was a language of Jewish literature, writing, wisdom. Today, after the Holocaust, we have very much diminished, alas, to two great languages of the Jews, the two great languages in which we communicate, Hebrew and English. Even we here cannot communicate in Swedish, I wish. Hebrew and English. And the idea behind writing our book in English, and our book is full of love poetry to the Hebrew language, is to try to offer a bridge, to try to suggest that many people who deem Hebrew to be the boring language of their childhood enforced Hebrew classes, Sunday school, what have you, try to tell them it is after all a magic language if you're approaching correctly. So I'd say yes, I'd love many people to be able to read or speak some Hebrew. But this is not a necessary condition. It's sufficient, but it's not a necessary condition. Having said all that, I'm so happy to tell you that since I went abroad first time as a 7-year-old girl, and no one in the world spoke Hebrew, until today when I hear so much Hebrew that I sometimes want to take care of my privacy, the only small language in the 20th century that grew rather than diminished is Hebrew, modern Hebrew. The only language in the 20th century that grew from 0 everyday speakers to 10 million everyday speakers today, 10 million, according to rather conservative estimates, is Hebrew. Not just in Israel, not just Israeli Arabs, not just Palestinian Arabs, but also many other people around the world. There are more people who speak Hebrew now than, I would not say Swedish, God forbid, they are not competing. More people speak Hebrew today than Danish. I thought you'd like it. But I'll tell you something more, which I like even better. There are more people who speak Hebrew today on an everyday basis than Austrian German. This makes me happy. I'm not a chauvinist, but so I hope that this is some answer, within the big map of the lost Jewish languages, the existing Jewish languages. I would like Hebrew to take pride of place without making anybody feel guilty. It's not a Jewish thing, but I'm against guilt. So approach, enjoy, give it a taste, come to Frida's classes, new classes which you have here, in the Folks Hochschule, I hope. And of course, Paideia. But remember that, like all human beings, we Jews can speak many tongues, and truth and beauty are not narrowed down to one language. So,